Hi everybody, my name is Ranger Mark and I'm a park ranger here at Yellowstone National Park. How many of you have been to Yellowstone? Seeing a few hands there, some of you not. Hopefully someday you'll be able to come to this amazing place as well. Now Yellowstone is truly a special place. It's one of my most favorite spots on the planet, I think. It's special to me in a lot of different ways. Today we're going to answer the question, why Yellowstone? And why was it a special place, an important place, a valuable place to so many different kinds of people? And I hope that during the next 20 minutes or so that you'll find that it's a special place as well. So as we get started here, I just wanted to talk about some of the earliest people that came into the area. In fact, we can go back about 11,000 years ago and have proof from artifacts and archaeological digs that there were people in the area that we know as Yellowstone today wandering around and living in this region. If we fast forward a little bit to about 300 or so years ago, we can start talking about more of the particular Native American tribes that some of the names might be familiar with even today. Some of those tribes included the sheep eaters, which were part of the Shoshone or Bannock tribes, and they were really special people. In fact, they came into the Yellowstone region and they would hunt and gather and utilize the resources, the animals, so forth, for a lot of different reasons. I brought with me today some things that I think are pretty cool. This here is a bow made from the horns of a bighorn sheep. Kind of looks like this, right? Well, the sheep eaters would take the material of a bone of a bighorn sheep and warm it up in a hot spring, or one of the hydrothermal features here in Yellowstone, and would be able to make it more pliable and moldable, if you will, and shape it into things like a bow. And also, they would take the horns of a bighorn sheep and be able to make spoons and ladles such as this, and just a lot of great tools that help them live life here in this area. And they also would utilize some of the rock that they would find in the area. There's a place in Yellowstone called Obsidian Cliff. It's a volcanic glass type material, and the sheep eaters and other Native American tribes would often take the obsidian, if you will, and fashion it into different tools and weapons and knives, and you can see even here the tip of an arrow. So, very special people as well. There were other early Native American tribes as well. There were the Crow that lived to the east side of the park area, the Blackfeet that lived to the north, and they would rely on some of these resources as well in our region, such as the bison. And I brought with me today what you might find the Crow or the Blackfeet or some of the other Native American tribes utilizing the bison for. I kind of like to think that this was probably a fly swatter or some other type of a feather duster to keep things clean that belonged to them and that sort of a thing. But they, as well, some of the Native American tribes would fashion the hooves of a bison into different tools and utensils, like a bowl here or a ladle out of a bison hoof. And one of my favorite items here that we have with us today is a bladder from a bison that the Native Americans could put water in or other things to drink and carry it around, much like you and I might carry around a canteen or a water bottle these days. So very, very creative. So, to the Native Americans, Yellowstone was a very special place indeed. In fact, I mentioned a few of the specific Native American tribes, but there's 26 official tribes that have an association or a history with the Yellowstone region. And those 26 tribes we still recognize today and consult with one another for a lot of modern day issues that it might relate to bison or other animals in the park and other things that we talk together, all of us, from all walks of life, to help Yellowstone continue to be a special place. But let's go back to the early 1800s for a moment, and now we can start talking a little bit about the early explorers. I might call them the fur trapper era, if you will. Now, before anybody from Euro-American descent came into the Yellowstone region, there were some people that came pretty close. Some of you might remember the names Lewis and Clark. They led an expedition that President Thomas Jefferson commissioned through the years 1804 to 1806. And they got close to the Yellowstone area. In fact, about 50 miles from the modern-day park border, in a place we know today as Livingston, Montana, about 50 miles north of the north entrance of the park. But they didn't quite get to Yellowstone. However, there was a man that was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition that convinced Lewis and Clark to allow them to leave the expedition a little early, and then a winter or two later, actually 1807 to 1808, John Coulter was the first documented fur trapper from Euro-American descent to come into the Yellowstone area. Now, at this point I want to ask, with all you've heard so far, why is it that people would explore a place like Yellowstone? We've talked about some of the things that the Native Americans valued, that they found important, but what do you think a person like John Coulter, what do you think he would have come into the park for? You see, he was all by himself. In the dead of winter, cold, snowing, all he had was his rifle, a pair of snowshoes, a pack horse with a few supplies. What would cause a man to come in by himself like that? If you guessed beaver, you are correct. I've got with me here today the pelt of a beaver, and in the early 1800s, beaver was all the rage. You see, people in Europe and in Eastern America, Eastern United States, they love to wear clothing out of beaver. And in fact, they love to wear beaver hats in particular. So I brought with me today, I'm going to take my ranger hat off for a second and put on a beaver hat. Now it's a little small. I don't know if I'm very fashionable looking right now. Doesn't quite fit. But if you had one of these back in the early 1800s, you were in style. It was very, very fashionable. So that is what drove people like John Coulter into places like Yellowstone in the early 1800s. And one of my favorite mountain men of that era was a man by the name of Jim Bridger. And I brought with me today a picture of Jim. He first came into the area in the 1820s, led a fur trapping brigade, and explored all over this region. And Jim was known for a lot of things. He told a lot of tall tales. In fact, he had one story where he said if you let out a shout near the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River, it wouldn't be till the next morning that the echo would return and wake you up out of your sleep. So he had all these different tall tales that he would speak to others, and not everybody believed these mountain men tall tales of upside down waterfalls and boiling pits of mud and all of that. But those myths and legends and stories, they persisted. So, having learned a little bit about some of the Native American tribes and some of the early mountain men of the Yellowstone region like John Coulter and Jim Bridger, I'd like to share with you a little ditty that I wrote that I simply call the Mountain Man Tribute Song. It goes something like this. Once there was a mountain man with strange stories to tell. He spoke of a wonderland that some called cold as hell. To him it was like heaven, this land of fire, ice, and snow. Its beauty was unsurpassed, this land called Yellowstone. Hats off to old John Coulter, raise a banner high. Throughout all of history, keep his memory alive. That he was making history, never once on him did dawn. And I doubt if we'd be standing here if it weren't for men like John. Once there was a mountain man, Jim Bridger was his name. From trapping to tall tales, he earned a lot of fame. He learned more from the Indians than we will ever know. He learned the ways of the Shoshone, the Bannock, and the Crow. Hats off to old Jim Bridger and all the native tribes. Throughout all of history, keep their memory they were making history never once occurred to them. And I doubt if we'd be standing here if it weren't for the tribes and the mountain men. Their stories and legends they tell of their fame. Compared to the mountain men, our lives are civil and we're tame. For the lives of discovery, we're much obliged to them. If there were men who loved this land, it was the tribes and the mountain men. Hats off to the mountain men and Yellowstone's tribes. Throughout all of history, keep the memory alive. That they were making history never once occurred to them. And I doubt if we'd be standing here if it weren't for the tribes and the mountain men. Yeehaw! But a lot of these old stories and legends persisted into the 1860s when at the time attention was turned away from Yellowstone because we had an unfortunate event here in the United States known as the Civil War, and a lot of the young men who might have been exploring out west at the time, their attention was turned away and had to be involved in the Civil War. Well, it wasn't until the late 1860s when all of a sudden some of these old legends and stories could finally be investigated a little further, and we began what is known as the Expedition Era, or the Grand Survey or Great Survey Era. And that started in 1869 in earnest, when there was three men by the name of Folsom, Cook, and Peterson that came into the Yellowstone area, this region of the upper river here, and saw all these amazing sights. And when they got back to their hometown in Montana, and the word started to get out a little bit about what they had seen and discovered, and with their own eyes at least. Of course, others had gone before them, decades prior, centuries prior, and seen all these things. But when they started to talk to their newspaper people back in their hometown and others, there were additional people that got interested. People like Washburn, Langford, and Doane, who led an expedition in 1870 into the Yellowstone region. It was that expedition that gave the name to Mount Washburn, that gave the name to that one particular upside-down waterfall that would erupt every 60 minutes or so back at that time. Today it erupts maybe every 90 minutes approximately. But it's a feature we call today as Old Faithful. It was the Washburn expedition that gave it its name. And when they got back, after seeing all these amazing sights, and started to talk more about it, and Nathaniel Langford, who wrote an article called The Wonders of the Yellowstone, and got it published, by the way, in a popular publication at the time called Scribner's Monthly. When word got out on that level, it finally piqued the interest of the United States government. And in 1871, the federal government put up $40,000 to fund what became known as the Hayden Expedition. Now, Ferdinand Hayden led that expedition of 1871. This is a picture of Ferdinand Hayden. He was a geologist, and he worked for the United States Geological Survey. He was a director for them, and he was the man who led the expedition. I brought a couple more pictures with me. This is the Hayden Expedition going alongside a lake, kind of near Yellowstone Lake. This is a photograph of one of their encampments that they stayed at during their expedition. And this is a photograph of the photographer who took those pictures that I just showed you. This is a man by the name of William Jackson, where he had a pack horse completely dedicated to glass plate technology. It took William Jackson all day to produce about 12 photographs. Now, if any of you were around in the 1970s, you might remember days when there was 12 exposures you could take on a camera that had some film in it. So I kind of like to think when I was a kid that I was experiencing maybe something like William Jackson was experiencing, where you were limited to about 12 photographs per day. Kind of a fun thing to think about. Well, Ferdinand Hayden not only had the insight, everybody, to bring along other scientists, other geologists and botanists and zoologists and so forth, but he brought with him other artists. Not only William Jackson, the photographer, but Henry Elliott, a sketch artist, and very important man by the name of Thomas Moran, who, upon getting back home after being part of the expedition, painted that painting called the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And when the scientific writings and the photographs of Jackson and the sketches of Elliott and the paintings of Thomas Moran got into the awareness of the American public and into the hands of the United States Congress, one of the most amazing things happened in our history. Can anybody guess what that might have been? I'll give you a hint. Congress got together and created a piece of legislation. Became known as the National Park Act. Yellowstone National Park became our world's first national park on March 1st, 1872, when our president at the time, President Ulysses S. Grant, signed the Yellowstone National Park Act into law. And that began a movement that, as we'll see here in a moment, spread out for decades and generations to come into the future, all across the world. Now, everything wasn't perfect on that day when Yellowstone officially became a national park. The next handful of years, there were problems. There wasn't enough money that Congress appropriated to help protect the park in ways that maybe we wanted to protect it. And it took until the year 1886, when finally the United States government sent in the Army, the 2nd Cavalry, that is. Now, I brought with me today a photograph of some of those early soldiers that came in to protect the park beginning in 1886. And by the way, you might notice a few things. They're kind of wearing a hat similar to my hat. They're wearing a jacket similar to my jacket. And we still have some of these military traditions today that persist from that era when the United States Army came in 1886. Well, they were tasked, they were charged with the responsibility of protecting the wildlife, the natural resources. You see, there were people that were coming in and trying to chip off and steal pieces of travertine from the Mammoth Hot Springs or pieces of geyserite from Old Faithful, and poaching and hunting animals that were illegal to do so. Well, one of the things that the Army was able to do is in 1894, they were able to capture a poacher by the name of Ed Howell, and they caught him poaching a number of bison in the park. And then in 1894, because of that event, Congress passed something called the Lacey Act, and that protected, going forward, all the wildlife in Yellowstone. No longer was it allowed, well, it never was allowed, but finally there was some punishment. There were some repercussions so that if anybody was caught poaching or hunting animals inside the park, they would be punished for it. And so some might say that was one of the greatest things that have happened in Yellowstone, because what it did, it really saved a lot of our animals. In fact, one of those animals was the American bison, as I showed you in that photograph a moment ago. But can anybody guess how few bison we were down to? They were almost extinct. It's a low number, about 2 dozen. In the early 1900s, this animal almost no longer existed. So we're thankful for the Army and for the cavalry and for some of those early soldiers to protect some of these things that are special, some of these animals that are very important to all of us. Now, as we continue to go forward in time, there was new ways of seeing the park, new ways of experiencing it. In 1902, we saw the very first automobile come into the park. This is a photograph from back then. Now, it wasn't quite legal yet. It would take a few more years before it would become legal. But people started to figure out ways to access the park so that they could recreate, so they could enjoy it in the ways that were important to them. You see, they'd come in by railroad or horse-drawn stagecoaches and go to places like the Old Faithful Inn, which opened in 1904, kind of representative of the Grand Hotel era, We had places like the Lake Hotel and the Old Faithful Inn and the Canyon Hotel as well, and these other places where people would come and gather, and they'd have these big ballroom dances and enjoy the park in ways that were special to them and important to them. So you kind of get the idea that it was a grand experiment in a lot of ways, that the way people enjoyed Yellowstone continued to evolve through time. And then finally, in 1916, after automobiles were officially allowed in the park, in 1915 by the way, it finally was recognized by the United States government that there needed to be a way to even better protect the park for years to come. You see, the Army was being drawn away to World War I over in Europe, and so there had to be a way to create a vehicle, if you will, a movement, so that the park here at Yellowstone and other national parks that were being formed at the time could remain protected. And so the National Park Service, everybody, was founded in 1916 with the passage of something called the Organic Act. And I brought with me a copy of the National Park Service mission statement that I thought we could read together. And it goes like this: to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So as we wrap up our time together, I want you to think about a few things. We've already talked about what makes a place special. We talked about the early Native American tribes. We talked about the mountain men or the fur trappers, and some of those early exploration people, the expedition era, if you will. We talked about the U.S. Army and how they played an important role in protecting Yellowstone. And then, of course, the National Park Service. But you see, it doesn't stop with just the National Park Service or rangers like me. It continues with people like yourselves for generations to come. So think about what places might be special to you. It could be an area near your hometown or your state. It could be a place that has wide open spaces, or a place that not only contains some natural resources but some cultural resources, or an important part of our history. So there might be places that you might find as you get older that are important to protect. Maybe you'll be part of establishing a brand new national park, or a national monument, or a national historic site, or maybe you'll protect a battlefield, or a lakeshore, or a seashore, or a national scenic riverway, or whatever it might be. You see, these are all examples of what is approximately 420 National Park Service units today that we have. 62 of those are national parks, but I think there's going to be a whole lot more in the years to come. And you see, it's going to be up to you and me, all of us that own these special places. As American taxpayers, we're the owners, and we get to decide what happens with these special places in the years to come. So think about those things. Think about what makes a place special to you. So with that, I just want to say thank you for hanging out with me today, for letting me share a little bit about the history of Yellowstone National Park and all the ways that it is a special place to so many different people. Thanks again.